Welcome back to the Contrarian, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I certainly am. It's been another snowy week here in Montana. I got out for another 20-mile cross-country ski yesterday, and there's just probably most snow on the ground that I've seen in a few years at least. A good 4 feet of coverage. But apart from that, it's really interesting just to see what's going on in the gold and silver space right now. In the last week, I would say a lot has happened. A lot of recent price action has kind of almost reinforced what I had already been talking about a week ago about gold repatriation and that kind of strengthening trend that we're seeing in the precious metals markets. Not just gold, but also silver as well. Just spikes in the demand that we're seeing, especially draining the LBMA metals exchange just to extreme levels to where there's almost no physical gold there. It's really just moving through there very quickly. But recently, Elon Musk's DOGE committee has called for an audit to Fort Knox. And there's a lot here because, there's a lot of, I would say, secrecy surrounding Fort Knox and whether or not they actually have 4,580 metric tons of gold there like the Fed supposedly has on their balance sheet. And, if they do in fact have it there, that would be a big asset that the Fed and Treasury could reprice and use essentially to rebalance and make their balance sheet a lot more healthy than what it is right now, because as it is right now, they're basically pricing their own gold at $42 an ounce when the price right now is about $2,900 an ounce. So if they were just to reprice their own gold at the current market price, they could really improve their balance sheet quite a bit. But if they were even to revalue gold higher than what it is now, they could make their balance sheet even more pristine. And suddenly the issue of a lot of debt would kind of fade into the backdrop. So there's a lot of importance to Fort Knox and whether or not it actually has the gold reserves there that they say that they do. And of course, this was kind of prompted by Zerohedge actually almost poking Elon Musk. He happened to see that tweet, and then Rand Paul also got on board with that. So it looks like there will be increased pressure in the coming weeks for the DOGE committee or organization or whatever you want to call it to actually audit Fort Knox. And this would be big news because Fort Knox has not been actually audited for probably upwards of 80 years, actually. It's been quite a long time. There was kind of a visit, you could say, that politicians and some Fed officials had in 1974 into Fort Knox. It was not a real audit. They only looked at something like 6% of the supposed reserves there, and they didn't actually compare any of the bars that they looked at, any of the serial numbers. They didn't weigh them to make sure that they weren't, fake gold bars, because there are ways that you can make a gold bar appear to be real, but have very little actual gold in it. And so the actual last real audit took place back actually in 1953. So that is almost, that's over 70 years ago now, 1953. And 1974 wasn't a real audit. And so it's really been a long time since anyone has audited Fort Knox. And, essentially it would be kind of a independent audit of the Fed and Treasury and the supposed reserves that the U.S. Fed and Treasury has, which they say is 4,580 metric tons of gold. And, at least after 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, I think at that point, for a while, people kind of lost the significance of what the U.S. government having these massive gold reserves would have. It's kind of the opposite story where, unlike the Fed, potentially saying that they have more gold than they actually do, in the Eastern central banks, China and Russia, central banks over there, in recent decades, they have really been stockpiling gold and really not been reporting all of their purchases of gold. So if anything, it's kind of the opposite story in the East, where those central banks likely have way more gold than what they have disclosed, whereas the Fed might have a lot less than what they disclose. Now, I say maybe because I don't know for sure, there's just a lot of suspicion in my mind when when you have 70 years go by, and especially if there were to be a lot of pushback on the part of some Fed insiders, like saying, "Oh no, you can't look at this." In my mind, that would really be suspicious. But we'll really need to wait and see how much pushback they get in terms of the audit. Now, another thing that kind of makes me suspicious in terms of just the price action of gold and silver in the last few weeks is just how much increased buying pressure there is in these markets. It's really quite different than what I've seen in the last few years that I've been paying attention to it. Because, for example, you had the CPI and the PPI both come in higher than expected this last week. Typically, that would be majorly bearish for gold and silver. You would see a lot of selling pressure, definitely on those days, and the rest, going forward, it would probably be kind of a, negative event for gold and silver. And if anything, both of those higher than expected inflation numbers didn't really impact the gold and silver markets sizably. I mean, you saw some, I would say, quick sell-offs that were then bought up fairly quickly, and overall just the buying pressure that was there, vastly outnumbered any kind of selling that took place as a result of these higher than expected inflation numbers. And so, in my mind, that does kind of indicate that something has changed sizably in these precious metals markets. That may be a signal that there's a return by more Western central banks, particularly the United States, in terms of repurchasing gold and just, almost a repatriation of their gold, I would say, because it could be the case where over the decades, the Fed, without being audited, essentially being kind of almost an independent financial institution, the Fed may have done some, deals that, U.S. Congress and other, governing bodies were not aware of. The gold may have been loaned out. I don't know this for sure. This is pure speculation on my part. But if it turns out that, a lot of the gold that we're seeing flowing back through the London Bullion Metals Exchange back, to other vaults, probably back to the United States primarily, it could be the case where a lot of that gold is essentially just being repatriated by the Fed, if it's actually loaned out overseas, etc. So hopefully, if the gold at Fort Knox has been loaned out, it can be repatriated. It's really interesting just to see a sudden interest, in terms of auditing Fort Knox, because it's kind of always been there as kind of a major thing that could be done. And, it's interesting that it's suddenly just coming up now as something that, Elon Musk and the DOGE committee are wanting to do, because, in my lifetime, it totally could have happened a lot earlier than this. But perhaps it's the case where until now, people weren't as perhaps skeptical of, the governing bodies, financial institutions, as they are now. And so, it's really interesting to see. This basically, it was Zerohedge that first tweeted this idea, tagged Elon Musk. He then kind of asked, hey, why hasn't Fort Knox been audited for 70 plus years? And then that kind of got the whole ball rolling. So I hope that, this snowball can continue to go, because auditing Fort Knox, restoring a sense of trust there, not only for the United States citizens, but also just around the world, because if Fort Knox does not have gold there, then essentially you don't have the possibility of, bringing back a gold-based currency of any form, because, at current gold prices, it would be very difficult for the Fed to amass enough gold to get anywhere close to what they would need. And so it's basically dependent on the Fed and the Treasury still having ownership of the gold that is supposedly there. If it's, for some reason completely gone, that would be very bad news, because it'd be very difficult for the Fed to acquire that much gold. I mean, there's just not that much gold in the world. It's a very rare commodity for obvious reasons. And so, 4,580 metric tons is a significant amount. I would say if they can restore trust in the Fed, in the Treasury, if they actually have these gold reserves there could suddenly be the potential to not only revalue gold on their balance sheet and to make their balance sheet much more pristine, but if anything, it could give the opportunity to do something like what economists like Judy Shelton and others have discussed, of having essentially a gold-backed treasury bond, which would effectively reintroduce a gold-backed dollar of sorts. And so once you go back onto a gold standard, suddenly your currency just has much more trust with it. It not only does it essentially give the idea to investors, to holders of treasury bonds and dollars around the world, that their dollars are exchangeable for a rare commodity like gold, but it also puts a restraint on the ability of a central bank to inflate away the value of the dollar. And that's been, of course, the whole concern in recent years with inflation and everything, and just the insane amount of dollars that have been created out of thin air. That does, gold-backed currencies and everything does put a huge restraint on that ability. And so, it'd be very interesting to see, the results of this. Hopefully, they are successful at actually doing some sort of a real audit at Fort Knox. And I hope it's not just another kind of fake audit like what was back in 1974, because there's plenty of ways that you could fake, massive amounts of gold, when in reality there really isn't anything there. So, I hope it's a real audit. I hope they're successful with it. We'll really need to wait and see, but, if anything in coming weeks, the first thing to indicate what direction it's going is probably just even the price of gold, I would say. If we continue to see increased buying pressure, causing just the gold price, silver price to continue to run higher, that would be kind of an indication in my mind that that there's just a lot of gold repatriation going on, essentially. So yeah, I would love to know what all of you think about this in the comment section below. Gold and silver and Fort Knox and everything. Love to know what you think about all of this, and I hope to see all of you again at some point.